I'm Justin Meissen, and today I'll be co-teaching with Kristine Nemec, and we'll be talking about identifying plants in CRP or Conservation Reserve Program plantings, or any reconstruction really, prairie reconstruction, as well as Iowa roadsides. So as we get started here, I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm Justin Meissen. I'm the Research and Restoration Program Manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. I work with farmers, conservation professionals, roadside managers, and other folks to improve prairie restoration through scientific research. And in my fieldwork studying prairie restorations and others, I've come across some tips I hope that I'll be able to share with you today that help me figure out what plants are growing where out in the Iowa landscape. We should also thank the organizations that have helped make this webinar series happen. Along with the whole staff at the Tallgrass Prairie Center, we're getting support from Practical Farmers of Iowa, Green Iowa AmeriCorps, and the University of Northern Iowa. In particular, I want to thank the following people who've really done some heavy lifting to make this course work as well as it has. Definitely want to thank Paige Schaefer, Stacy Miller, and the UNI IT staff. So thank you very much. So a few course announcements before we get started with the main part of the webinar. We've now got the June 17th webinar posted, so do head over and take a look if you need a refresher on any of last week's material. Homework number 2 will also be posted soon, so check for that this week. Another reminder that if you have yet to take the survey, please do take that and keep the conversation going over on the Botany Beginners Facebook group. And finally, as always, visit the Tallgrass Prairie Center website and look in the resources section for all kinds of information on planting and managing prairies. Okay, so to start off, let's kind of recap our overall goals here for Botany Beginners. You know, what we want to do, we want to help you learn how to learn plants. So throughout the course, we're focusing on learning the names of plants that you should know as an Iowan or someone who's interested in Iowa. We also want to help build the vocabulary that you'll need to learn on your own using field guides and other botany resources. And then through this course, you'll also gain an appreciation for some of Iowa's natural areas and the plants that define them. And then finally, we just want to help create a community of emerging botanists all across the state. So Botany Beginners is a course that's primarily based off 6 pre-recorded lectures. We focus our attention on important topics in botany and around plants of the day that help illustrate those ideas. We're using Newcomb's Wildflower Guide as a text to work with from this course, so we'll be using that as we work through our plant list. Each lecture has homework associated with it, along with quizzes throughout the course. And we encourage conversation about the material that we cover in our Facebook group. And then lastly, we'll also be hosting virtual field days later in July to cover some of the topics that we've talked about on the webinar series. So here's where we are in the course. This is the 4th of 6 lectures. Next week, I'll be back with Laura Walter to talk about remnant prairie plants, and Paige Schaefer will finish the course in 2 weeks with continuing your botanical journey. So recall from previous lectures that we discussed some basic terminology when describing plants, particularly in how we describe flowers as regular or multi-parted, leaf types as alternate, opposite, whorled, leaf edges as entire, toothed, lobed, or divided. We use Newcomb's guide with that terminology to identify several plants, but we also used other guides like Minnesota Wildflower's website. Last week, we talked about plant families and how each family has unique traits that help identify species belonging to that family. Like asters, for instance, have the disc and ray florets that are unique flower modifications. And lastly, we talked about a few strategies for plant ID without flowers, waiting until we do have flowers, and looking to see if other similar plants have flowers. Those were some of the strategies that we looked at. So today we're going to focus on identifying plants that you commonly encounter in Conservation Reserve Program plantings, or CRP plantings, as we're going to talk about. There are a lot of CRP acres in Iowa, and many of you may have CRP or know someone who does. We want to help you better understand those lands. And we'll also be looking at roadsides and the plants that are important there. One botany skill that I hope to impart today, at least in part, is how to look at a landscape and pick out patterns from what is initially a lot of plant noise. So we'll be looking at a lot of landscapes and getting experience picking out different flowers in the sea of vegetation. We'll also talk about how to use seed mixes or the age of plantings to help us ID plants. And we'll also cover some easy tips that can help us identify weeds, or at least narrow down our possible plant list. And then I'll hand it over to Kristine Nemec, who will talk about roadside plant identification. So let's begin with our first plant of the day. This is a landscape photo of a CRP planting in central eastern Iowa that was enrolled in the CP42 Pollinator Habitat Initiative. And sort of imagine taking a walk out on this piece of land. One thing that we notice is this purple flower seems kind of important. It's right here in front of us, and we can see, it's also in the distance. So it's pretty common, whatever it is. Well, it's a good thing we have nucums with us, so let's use that to figure out what this important plant is. So first thing we want to do is the three classifications. So remember, these are on the inside cover of nucums. So we'll need to get closer to the plant, and we'll need to look at each of the main parts. So first are the flowers. So what kind of flowers do we have? I'm seeing irregular. The flowers themselves are only symmetrical in one way. They're not radially symmetrical, even though the flower head is made up of many symmetrical parts. Next, let's take a look at the plant type. How would we classify this? I'm seeing this as a wildflower. It's got opposite leaves. Yes. And then lastly, let's take a look at the leaves and how would we classify those? Okay, I see toothed. Yeah, those leaves are very prominent, have very prominent teeth. So that gives us a group number of 143. So if we look at 143 to find the page number in nucums, we will use our dichotomous key. So our first question is whether we have yellow flowers or not. Definitely not. These are pink, light pink. So we'll continue under the flowers not yellow. Next, we need to figure out if the stalks or if the flowers are stalkless or not, and if the flowers are in heads. So looking at our flower, we don't have flower stalks and they are in heads. So this is sounding pretty good. The next thing looks like we're going to need to measure the flowers. So luckily Nucums has a ruler on the same page as the three classifications. So we can use that to make our measurements. And after measuring, we found that it looks like the flowers are a little bit over 1 inch long. So that means we should go to page 92. Now we know this is some kind of bergamot. However, it looks like we're going to need to dig a little more to figure out which one it is. So our flowers are not red or deep purple. We've very much got pink flowers. So that leaves wild bergamot or basil balm. Now, if we read through the range for each of these and the description of the plants, we see that basil balm is only found east of the Mississippi. Its westernmost point is in Illinois, and it's common in the woods. Well, we found our plant in the open in Iowa, so that would suggest that what we're looking at is wild bergamot. So why did we focus on wild bergamot for our first plant of the day? Well, based on studies that we've done at the Tallgrass Prairie Center, it is the most common plant out there on CRP plantings, at least in eastern Iowa. So clearly, we're going to want to be able to ID the most common CRP plant today. What we're looking at here is a visual list of the top 10 most common CRP wildflowers in order. And you'll see that while we don't cover all of them today, we will cover the top 4. And some of these should also be familiar from the previous lectures. Remember here that we learned 2 more in the last lecture as plants of the day, and that was number 6 and number 9. So I encourage you all to revisit that if you need a refresher on those. And of course, the list of these plants will be in the mystery plant list that we'll post. So most of those top 10 CRP wildflowers were also the top species planted in seed mixes out there. So if we had a seed mix for that site that we looked at, we probably would have noticed that wild bergamot was on that list. And that brings up a good point, which is that if we keep seed mix records for CRP planting, we're actually keeping a document that's going to be really helpful for identifying what's out there. You know, we can think of a seed mix as a sort of a blueprint for the vegetation. What we plant ideally is what we should expect to find growing. Of course, if we have seasoned prairie restoration folks listening, you know that this is not always the case, but it's still a pretty reliable principle. In that way, the seed mix acts as a plant list that shows us what plants to look for, and that narrows down the possibilities quite a lot. So Newcombs has over 1,000 different plants in it, and the seed mix is going to narrow the possibilities down to 30 or 40. Of course, this doesn't account for the weeds, but it's still very helpful. The other thing seed mixes can help with is that we can use them to set expectations for how commonly we should find plants in the mix. So we can look at the seeding rate to know how much of each species was planted, and based on that, we would expect plants with high seeding rates to be quite common, plants with low seeding rates to be more rare. Now, this relationship between high seeding rate and high abundance is not always great, since different plants have different size seeds and establishment rates. But again, the general principle can be useful. So if we look at this example, which is a real CRP seed mix planted in 2015, we see a list of species planted and the rate each plant was seeded at. So most of the time the column will be in pounds per acre, or pounds per, or PLS per acre, or seeds per square foot, or even percent mix. And those are all ways to express the seeding rate. So here we have our seeding rates in pounds per acre. And we see that the list is sorted already by seeding rate. So we should expect that side oats grama and Virginia wild rye should be pretty common grasses. And prairie mimosa and partridge pea should be pretty common wildflowers. This is another example of a seed mix. You can see that they get a little more complicated sometimes. This one's kind of tough to read, but again, we want to be looking for the different seeding rate measures. And in this one, it is expressed in mix percent. So in general, lots of records about a CRP planting can help us understand what the vegetation is out there and even why it might be that way. So keep all your records. This is especially important with seed mixes. So a lot of folks will receive the initial seeding plan after working with the NRCS, which is the branch of the Department of Agriculture that helps landowners with conservation programs. And people often assume that that's their seed mix. So the document on the right here is an example. you'll note they're very similar to seed mixes. However, because there might be availability issues for some seed, the seed vendor might actually propose a different seed mix that's available, and that mix might be different than the original plan. So make sure you keep both of them. But have the seed mix, but the seed mix that was actually purchased and put into the ground, that's the most important one to have. Also, having records about when you planted is important too. So as we'll learn, knowing the year and the season it was planted can help us predict what kind of plants are likely to be common, depending on when we visit the site. Okay, it's time for a quick botany break. So I think at this point, I will answer any questions, and I'll make sure to repeat the questions so that we all hear it.
The first question is, I am planting a backyard that was torn up. What species might be adapted and short enough for a backyard?
Okay, so there are a lot of different options, and this is it's a good question. So I would say that instead of going into some very elaborate list of species, I think what I would suggest would be taking a look at some of the resources out there that are available, especially to folks who are planting a backyard prairie. Off the top of my head, I can think of a catalog in particular called the Prairie Moon Seed Nursery Catalog, and that, or the cultural guide rather, is the actual document. And that has a lot of different, I would say has the majority of prairie species that are going to be commercially available. And you can look, and they have different columns of different traits for each of the plant species. And you can find the height of different plant species. So of course, if you want something short, typically want to look for something that's going to be about 3 feet tall max. There's not all that many prairie species that are like that, and they're easy to establish from seed, but there are certainly quite a few. Cytotes grama is a great example of a grass. That's a good one to use. And then there's a lot of different forbs, like purple prairie clover is also another good one to consider.
Remember to repeat the question, Justin. And where do seeds come from? Who harvests them? And how are they up for sale?
Okay, so the question was where do prairie seeds come from? How do we harvest them, and how are they for sale? So prairie seeds come from, the ones that you would buy commercially are usually going to be coming from a seed farm where they are sort of, prairie plants are put into agricultural production in usually long rows, and seed companies will use a combine to harvest them, clean those seeds using very sophisticated machines. And that clean seed is what is, it's tested, it's sent to a seed lab to make sure that the seed is viable, and it gives you the viability, and that seed is then put on the market for sale through a variety of vendors, which you could, if you're interested in getting a sense of how many native seed vendors are out there in Iowa, there's a good resource on the Tallgrass Prairie website that is the seed vendors. I forget exactly what it is. I think Stacy maybe, or Paige can put a plug in for that.
I'll put it in the chat, and that was our last question.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I think we'll continue on then. Okay, so I want us to keep thinking about one thing that we just covered, which is the age of a planting is going to give us clues about what plants have established and are blooming. So our second plant of the day is one of the classic examples of this. So let's do another photo field tour. This is another CRP planting in east central Iowa. And as we look at this landscape, we see quite a bit of variation out there. You know, we've got some patches of grass, some tall plants scattered around, but we're definitely seeing a plant that's flowering here, and that's flowering in abundance. You know, it's over near, it's all over near us, and it goes well into the distance. So this is certainly an important plant at this site this year. So let's take a look at this one. Okay, let's run through nucums, beginning by doing the 3 classifications. First, let's have a look at the flowers. So what flower type are we looking at? Yep, it's definitely regular symmetry in the flowers, and it's clear that we have more than 7 parts. Next, we can take a look at the plant type. So what are we working with here? Clearly, that's a wildflower with alternate leaves. And then finally, we'll look at the leaves. So what is the leaf type here? This one's slightly tricky since there do seem to be some very faint teeth. So that's going to be toothed or lobed. Okay, so what group number does that give us? 733. And reading through the keys, what page number should we check? We've got yellow flowers that are daisy-like and have a dark center. So that would suggest we want to look on page 374. All right, then what's our plant? We've got flowers that are 2 to 4 inches wide, and the leaves are just barely toothed versus coarsely toothed. And that's black-eyed Susan. Now, note on nucums here that the accepted scientific name is Rudbeckia hirta rather than Rudbeckia serratina. So remember, if the scientific names are giving you trouble, just check on the plants database for confirmation. So now that we know how to identify black-eyed Susan, let's talk about how that fits in with CRP Age. Now, the reason we're able to use CRP Age as a plant ID tool is because when a bare field gets planted with native grassland species, there's a fairly predictable pattern in how we expect the vegetation to change over time. Certain species become very apparent in some stages, quite difficult to find at all in others. So in general, here is what we expect. The first year is invariably dominated by annual weeds. Pretty simple. The second year is usually characterized by short-lived plants and an abundance of flowers from those species. The third year often has a mix of short and longer-lived plants. And by year 4 and beyond, the flowering vegetation becomes quite variable year to year and is mostly made up of long-lived plants. So let's take a look at each of those ages. So let's take a look at year 1. Most CRP managers or landowners prefer to use mowing throughout the season to prevent annual weeds from spreading into adjacent fields for aesthetic reasons. But there's also some science to show it does help speed up the establishment process. While that's very good for the CRP planting, it makes identifying plants really hard since mowing changes the way a lot of plants look even after they come back. However, in early fall, there often are at least a few prairie plants that are identifiable, especially if you hold off on mowing in September. But by and large, most of the prairie plants, while many have germinated and are there on site, they're still very small seedlings that are extremely difficult to identify. If you don't end up mowing, whether it's because the spot is too wet or just got away from you, you've got lots of opportunities to identify plants, most of which are annual weeds or cover crop. Even in this situation without mowing, most prairie plants are going to be extremely small seedlings, again, that are very difficult to ID, though you would be able to find one occasionally towards the end of the season. So what I want to do here and with each of the CRP stages, show you a photo of the vegetation at large, give you examples of how we can pick out plants to identify them from the apparent sea of green. So some of these are slides, really these slides are more of a reference. So we're not going to dwell too much on the different species we see. So we're going to look at a list of quite common annual weeds that we might expect to find in a first-year planting. But you'll also see we can see an example of the first plant of the day as well, just black-eyed Susan. Okay, so the second year of CRP, we generally have an abundance of short-lived plants. That often includes both grasses and wildflowers. And in particular, we have several readily identifiable plants like black-eyed Susan, yellow coneflower, Canada wild rye. We covered black-eyed Susan already, and we will cover yellow coneflower later in the webinar, though Canada wild rye is not one we've covered yet. It's a bunch grass that has very unique, drooping, wheat-like flower heads, and you can see it in the middle of the photo here. Another thing to expect is that annual weeds are still likely to be occasional or even common. And in this photo, we can see a tall, dark green plant, which is annual weed, horseweed. So here's another diagram of some important plants in the second year of a CRP planting. Then in year 3, we begin seeing longer-lived plants alongside the shorter-lived ones. So at this point, most of the prairie plants have established to the point of at least some of them are flowering or starting to flower. We'll have the main plants from year 2 blooming, like wild rye, yellow coneflower, and black-eyed Susan, but to a much lesser extent. Most of the rest of the seed mix is nearly done establishing or preparing to flower at this point. And the annual weeds have more or less gone away by year 3. They're just not able to compete with well-established perennial vegetation. So here are species of year 3. And then as we move into year 4 and beyond, the observable vegetation becomes mostly dominated by long-lived plants. By and large, year-to-year variation is becoming the main thing that drives differences in flowering. And the worm season grasses are becoming more prominent as they get closer to reaching their full size. The short-lived plants like wild rye and black-eyed Susan are becoming more uncommon. And often around this time, we see fewer wildflowers in absolute terms, but often more variety in what's blooming. Here's some of the key plants in this stage of CRP. All right, time for another botany break.
I just have them remind that we have numbered plants throughout the presentation.
Yeah, okay. So just want to remind everybody that the plants, the mystery plants, are all numbered throughout the presentation. So if you ever have questions about what the plants that you saw were, those are going to be available to look at on the mystery plant or challenge plant list that page will post.
Our first question is milkweed included in the mixes? Remember to repeat.
So the question is milkweed included in the mixes? Usually it is, yes, in some way, whether that's common milkweed. We have a lot of different species of milkweed in Iowa, and I will give away at least a little bit of this challenge plant. It is a milkweed. That one is in some mixes. So we also have like butterfly milkweed, swamp milkweed. So usually there's at least one milkweed species in a relatively diverse prairie plant mix. So, you know, it's always good to look at your seed mix, make sure that it is, and request an addition of milkweed if that's interesting to you. Of course, we like to have more milkweed on the landscape for monarchs. And if you are concerned, there's sometimes folks are concerned about milkweed being adjacent to crop fields that could cause problems, and I would suggest trying a different species of milkweed, like butterfly milkweed, or even prairie milkweed, or world milkweed, swamp milkweed. There's other options out there that are not going to become nearly as aggressive as common milkweed can become.
We have another milkweed question, Justin, and then we'll move on. Kate says, I suddenly have a ton of milkweed on my prairie this year. Why so much so suddenly?
The question is, Kate has a whole bunch of milkweed this year on her prairie, and she's wondering why that would be. You know, I don't think I have a great answer to that. Sites, you know, different sites have different reasons for having certain things like that occur. Sometimes mowing can benefit milkweeds. They typically like getting mowed once during the year. That could be part of it if it got mowed. Most prairie plants respond very well to fire in the early spring. That potentially could have something to do with it. Or it could be a function of age. You know, milkweeds are plants that usually take at least a couple of years to start really blooming en masse. So that could be part of it as well. All right. Okay, so we'll keep moving here. All right, so for the third plant of the day, let's take a walk through a prairie strip, which is a new CRP practice this year. So we come upon this patch and we see it's pretty dense. Should probably figure out what that plant is. So you can see it's starting to bloom just barely with some pink flowers. So maybe, I don't know, maybe it's wild bergamot, because we know that's a very commonly planted plant. So let's take a closer look. So let's run through Newcombs, beginning by doing the 3 classifications. So we'll start with the flower type. What is this? So this is a new classification, and what we see is that there are no visible flower parts. They're all hidden away from us, and we can only see the ray florets. So we can't tell how many parts it has. So that's 8. It's indistinguishable. Now let's take a look at the plant type. What is this looking like? Looks like an alternate leaved wildflower to me. Let's take a look at the leaves. What might that be? This one's a bit tricky, and some of the other leaves on the plant have more deep waves in the leaves, but this would be considered divided. Okay, so what's our group number with that? 834. And the page number, if we look at the key, it looks like we have some irregularly lobed and prickly leaves. So that will lead us to page 430. And what is the plant ID? Looks like the flower heads are less than 1 inch tall. So that's Canada thistle. And that is one of the most common weeds in CRP plantings. So talking about Canada thistle is a good reason to bring up the topic of weeds, and specifically noxious weeds. You've probably heard the term before, and it can be confusing. While different states and organizations have different definitions, noxious weeds are generally plants that cause damage to crops, livestock, people, or ecosystems, and they're generally regulated by law. In Iowa, we have a few classifications of noxious weeds, and we'll focus on the ones that the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship have deemed priority noxious weeds. These are weeds that the county weed commissioner might compel you to control if there is a significant infestation on your land. You can see the whole list on this link I have here. So if you look at it, you'll notice that thistles make almost half of the list. So we should probably get used to identifying thistles, like our last plant of the day, which is a priority noxious weed. But while most thistles are noxious weeds, there are non-noxious thistles that are lookalikes. So for example, our native pasture thistle on the right is a really great nectar source for monarch butterflies and all kinds of other pollinators. We really wouldn't want to destroy those plants. So how do we tell them apart? So luckily, there's a pretty quick and easy test to know if a thistle is noxious or not. What we do is look at the underside of the leaf. If it's bright white, it's not noxious. Simple. So let's go through some examples you're going to commonly encounter. The first example, bright white undersides. Next, light green underneath. Next example, more light green underneath. So what are these thistles? So that last one is the noxious Canada thistle. Medium one is noxious bull thistle. And the first one here with the white underneath is our non-noxious pasture thistle. So that leaf test is especially useful in telling apart the non-noxious pasture thistle with bull thistle, which grow in very similar growth forms. And you can see they have pretty similar looking leaves. So the last thing I want to cover here is about some general ID tips and tricks that might help you narrow down your search if you have an unknown plant. And particularly an unknown plant that might be very common, like this grass on the right. Now, one thing that can be helpful to know, especially in earlier CRP plantings, is whether plants that we're seeing are annual or perennial. Now, that distinction can be helpful because if we determine a plant's annual, it's probably not a prairie plant, since most of those are perennial, though there are important exceptions like black-eyed Susan and partridge pea. But mostly, if we have an annual out there, it's a field weed. Another reason that this is helpful is it's a characteristic that you'll often find in field guides. And that's going to help you as you use more advanced dichotomous keys and other botany resources. And knowing if you have annuals or perennials is going to be helpful for thinking about weed management in CRP. So annual weeds, assuming our prairie plants have established well, are likely to take care of themselves over time, while perennial weeds are going to probably require some intensive treatment. So we'll go over a test we can do in the field that can help make some sense of the vegetation that you see here on the right, and it'll actually help you differentiate it from what you see here, even though they look extremely similar. Before we go any further, I need to preface this part by saying in no uncertain terms what we're going to be talking about. This is a destructive test, so we should not be using this in a situation where there could be rare plants around, like in a never plowed pasture or on any kind of public land. Don't do this in prairie remnants or on the roadsides. This is only a test you should do on your own land in CRP or in a prairie reconstruction context. Okay, now that we're clear about where this is appropriate to do, this test will help us determine whether a plant is annual or biennial. It's really something that works best when we have moist soil, so don't try it in dry, heavy soils, for example. If the plant is really large, this test might not work out very well either, so it's best on smaller plants. So what you do is you find a single stem of an unknown plant, grasp it at the base, gently pull it out of the ground, and we examine what comes up. Significant root system comes out, it's likely annual or biennial. But if the stem breaks off without its roots or with a clear horizontal break in the root near the top, probably perennial. But you've got to be careful or be willing to do some destruction because young or short-lived perennial plants will also come up easily like that. And that does destroy the plant. So let's look at a few examples. Remember, if a relatively complete root system comes out, it's likely annual or biennial. So here we've got an example of an annual forb, giant ragweed, an example of an annual grass, giant foxtail. And you can see that a significant part of the root systems came out, including some fine roots. the stems break off or break off at the root horizontally, it's likely perennial. So here's an example of a perennial forb, which is rhizomatous. And we see the white part here is where the root broke horizontally. This is sneezeweed. And over here we have an example of a perennial sod-forming grass, which is a weed as it happens, which is smooth brome. And that stem just broke right off at the base of the soil surface. Okay, so we talked about several weeds tonight, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions about how to control weeds in CRP, or maybe more generally. Unfortunately, that's a huge topic that would probably require its own course to cover appropriately. So instead, I just want to show you some resources that you can use to hopefully answer your questions about how, if, how, and when to treat the weeds you'll now be able to identify. So the first one is the Tallgrass Prairie Center Guide to Prairie Restoration in the Upper Midwest. You can get that from University of Iowa Press. And if you do use it, focus on chapters 6 and 10. Another resource I would recommend is the Nature Conservancy's Weed Control Methods Handbook. This has a lot of excellent information on all kinds of weeds and control methods, and that's available for free at the website that I've got linked here. Lastly, there's going to be an upcoming webinar from UW-Madison, weed science researchers that might provide a new forum for you to ask questions. And the link to that is listed here. Okay, with that, we'll take a botany break, and following that, I'll hand it over to Kristine Nemec, who will talk about plants in the roadside.
Our first question is, are there any tips to ID milk thistle, or how is that different than any of the other thistles you mentioned? Repeat the question.
So the question is about how do you identify milk thistle? And so milk thistle, to my knowledge, is not particularly common in Iowa. I think that's more of an herb, a medicinal herb that's maybe escapes from cultivation sometimes, but I couldn't tell you any good ways to tell that one apart, mostly because it's not particularly commonly encountered, at least in my experience.
The next question is, if you're in a first year CRP planting, when they are very small, will walking on them kill the plants? Remember that.
So the question is, if we're walking around in a CRP planting, does it kill the plants? By and large, no, it does not. Especially if the plant, once the plants germinate and they are growing mostly underground. So they're putting most of their resources towards the root systems, and so usually when we're walking on them, it doesn't actually sever the plants. I mean, I suppose if you were to really kind of go and stomp around, you might be able to do some damage, but normal walking is usually not going to cause problems. A tractor will. Tractors can cause some problems.
I think we're good, Justin. Kristine, you're good to go.
Great. Justin, can you stop sharing your screen? Then I'll go ahead and share mine. Great.
Are you able to share your, oh, there you go. Perfect.
There we go. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Kristine Nemec. I'm the program manager for the Iowa Roadside Management Program. So I support counties across Iowa that choose to have a roadside vegetation program. In the first session, Paige shared this kind of humorous guide that Chris Helzer with the Prairie Ecologist blog came out with. It's called A Field Guide to Roadside Wildflowers at Full Speed. And in it, he shows pictures of wildflowers from your vehicle going at full speed. So they're kind of blurry. It's kind of a humorous field guide. If you'd like to get out of your vehicle or at least really slow down and take a closer look at roadsides, you can see some really neat plants as opposed to just seeing a blur as you're driving quickly along. So if you would like to get out on foot, you can. Rights of way along state roadsides and county roadsides throughout Iowa are public property. They're public rights of way. I suggest that you take care when you're parking your vehicle, make sure it's really visible from people who might be coming up from behind you. It helps to wear brightly colored clothing or a safety vest so you're really visible. Try to avoid being on the roadside when it's dim lighting near dawn or dusk. And you'll notice a lot of roadsides have a shortly mowed clear zone for safety and visibility. Up on this hill, you can see this. On paved roads, it's typically around 8 feet or so. It might be a little narrower on county roads. So as you're walking down that, it's fairly easy to see your footing. But anytime you get into this dense vegetation along roadsides, keep in mind it's often pretty uneven. There might be wet spots or holes. So it's okay to explore, just be more careful than you would be on a level site. And also I suggest that you wear waterproof shoes. It'll help keep your feet dry. I'm going to introduce my first challenge plants. Number 14 is the purple plant that you see here. And number 15 is the white plant. If you want to jot those down, this was taken in Cerro Gordo County, by the way, if you want to know where this roadside picture was taken. Now, as you pay attention to roadsides, you may notice this grass, which is flowering right now. It flowers around May through July. So this is what it looks like, what the flower head looks like. This is smooth brome. It's pretty common along roadsides. It was introduced from Eurasia in the 1800s as a forage grass. It's also been planted by some roadside departments. It's not quite as common now, but it's fairly commonly planted. It's pretty aggressive, so it's not the ideal grass to have around native plantings, but it's what you'll often see in the roadsides. One unique characteristic about smooth brome, if you take a close look at the leaf, kind of near the tip, you'll see this little indentation. Now, if you look at it, if you're from Minnesota, you might say, well, that looks like an M. If you're from Wisconsin, you might say, oh, it looks like a W. So either way, whatever letter you want to choose, this is what you can look for if you want to tell something smooth brome. That's kind of a unique feature of this leaf. Also, as you start paying attention to roadsides, you might notice some more diverse areas. Sometimes they might be plantings. About half of the counties in Iowa have a roadside vegetation program where they have someone on staff who intentionally goes out and plants diverse stands of native seed along the roadside. So this helps reduce erosion, provides habitat, helps trap snow during the winter, helps keep it from blowing across the road. There's many benefits of having plantings along the road. Roadside programs do more than this. They also judiciously use herbicides to control weeds. They use spot mowing. They basically manage the roadsides in an ecological manner. If you want to see where some plantings have been done throughout Iowa, Stacy Miller worked on this really cool project called a story map a few years ago. It's on our website at this address. I'd like to point out that just some of the roadside plantings, not all of them, we just asked the roadside managers to pick a few of your favorite in your county and send a picture, let us know where the planting is. So this is by no means exhaustive. There have been thousands of acres of county roadsides planted throughout Iowa over the last 20 years or so. But if you go to this page, this is the front page of the story map. And if you hover over these little circles on the left side, you can read about the benefits of roadsides, the history of prairie and roadside plantings in Iowa. If you hover about the 4th or 5th circle, you'll see this little dialogue comes up, plantings across Iowa. And if you click on it, It brings you to this map of Iowa. And here I've just zoomed in on one part around Meissen City. And anytime you see a little flower, that's where a roadside manager has submitted a planting. So there's going to be a picture here. If you click on the flower, there's a picture and it tells you a little bit more about the planting. So you're welcome to explore visually or get some ideas for places to visit, or you can always just explore and find plantings on your own. But if you want to know for sure where some plantings have been done, you can go here. And the appearance of the plantings changes over time, but this is a good starting point. So the plants of the day that I'm going to introduce that we're going to key out from Newcombs are both commonly used in roadside seed mixes. So this is going to be our first one. Here's a few pictures of it. So first we're going to ask ourselves, what's the flower type? And I try to include a nice overhead at the top so you can count the petals. If you take a close look, well, it looks like there's going to be 7 or more petals is what I'm counting. 7 or more regular flower parts. The plant type, well, it's clearly a wildflower. Looking at the leaf, well, this is one leaf, but you can see there's nothing opposite it. So it's obviously an alternate leaf shape or alternate leaf type. And as far as the shape of the leaf, it's deeply indented. So thinking back to our terminology, if it's deeply indented like this, it's probably going to be lobed. So based on that, this is the group number we're looking for, 733. So if we look up 733 as the group number in our locator key, now we're going to try to figure out the page number. So first we look at the flower color. Well, it has yellow flowers. So now, does it look like a dandelion or more daisy-like or aster-like? Well, it's looking more daisy-like, I would say. So then we look at flower heads with a dark central disc or flower heads with a yellow or green center. And when we're talking about the disc, we're usually talking about the disc flowers. There's little tiny flowers around the top of the plant. Not so much the cone at the very top, but the little disc flowers. So they're above the petals and around the cone, the little disc flowers themselves. It looks like they're dark. So that's going to be page 374 is where we're going to go next. So here's the picture of the flowers opposite 374. Looks like only one is with the petals clearly drooping down from the cone. And it says that's gray-headed coneflower. I think I feel pretty comfortable with that. I hope you do too. This is also often called yellow coneflower as the common name. The scientific name is Retibida pinnata. And this is in the composite family, also known as the Asteraceae family or the aster family. We learned our families last time, so it's kind of nice to remind ourselves, start looking for what family each plant is in. Oh, it's time for a botany break. This is mystery plant number 16. This is also our state flower. It's commonly flowering along roadsides throughout Iowa right now.
Okay, Kristine, our first question is, how can you tell what is a county road and what is not? Are there any types of roadsides that aspiring botanists are not allowed to explore?
County roads, if it's a gravel road, it's pretty much usually a county road. Paved roads can be either one. I would say consult a good gazette or atlas for your county to know for sure. And if it's not accessible to exploring, there should be signs clearly marking it. But generally, most roadsides are public property. You just have to be careful of being mindful of where the property line is. And usually that's fairly well marked by the landscaping or the cropland, I guess. But generally, width to width, I'd say the width of a county roadside can be up to around 30 feet or so. So you don't want to be exploring further than that. You don't want to be encroaching on private property. I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Our next question is, how can I get my county to participate in this roadside wildflower program?
Well, first point of contact, you could reach out to me, and my contact information is listed on our website, and I can explore maybe what your county would be interested in. If a county citizens tell the Board of Supervisors, that can be a really good starting point. If there's public interest and they hear it from the citizens, that's how many of the roadside programs I'm familiar with get started, because they hear that need. So sometimes I've gone to a county and I almost always bring a county roadside manager or county engineer, so they have that county perspective. They're hearing from someone besides just me, and we just explain what the program's about, how it gets started, how to address any of the challenges of starting a program, that sort of thing. So I'm always willing to talk to any counties that are interested in exploring if this is right for their county.
That's all the questions we have right now. Thanks, Kristine.
Sure. Another roadside plant of the day we're going to key out today is this one. It's also often used in seed mixes. It's economical to buy. It has good wildlife habitat value. It's showy and pretty. Here's a nice close-up of the flowers if you want to count the flower parts. Looks like there's going to be 5 regular flower parts. And it's a wildflower. Looking at the leaves, it looks like they're alternate. As far as the leaf type, pretty much looks like they're divided. They clearly have leaflets. So the group number is going to be 5, 3, 4. Next, it asks, are the flowers really small, or are they a 1/4 inch or more wide or long? Well, looking at them, they don't look super small. We don't have a scale or anything, but they don't appear tiny. So let's go with a 1/4 inch or more wide or long. They're yellow flowers. And then we look at the leaves. I included a diagram from the first session so we can remind ourselves what does pinnately divided look like versus palmately divided. It appears they are pinnately divided. So we're going to go to page 236. Looking at the flowers here, well, these leaves look pretty similar in both of these plants, but just looking at the flower size, it's a lot smaller on wild sensitive plants. So it looks like it's probably going to be partridge pea. Doesn't really look like anything else on the page. So let's look here. Partridge pea. It's in the genus Cassia fasciculata, which is in the family Fabaceae, which is the legumes. And I used to have a coworker who loved this name so much that he named his daughter after this plant because he just loved the genus name. It is a very pretty name. But as we learned last week, if you want to be sure you have the most up-to-date scientific name, you're always welcome to check the USDA plants database. And if you do, you'll find that this one actually does have a different genus assigned to it now. It's Chemacrista fasciculata. So if you need to have the most accurate scientific name, just keep that in mind. But still, this is a great tool, great resource to get down to the right plant. Okay, this is challenge plant number 17. This weekend, I spent some time driving around the roadsides in Black Hawk County just to see what I could find. And this is kind of a neat plant. It's not super common. It's not planted along the roadsides, but it just goes to show if you go exploring, you can find some really neat plants growing throughout the roadsides. Next, number 18 and 19, also very commonly found over the weekend, at least in Black Hawk County. 18 is sometimes included in the seed mixes too. 19 is not. 18 also comes in on its own sometimes. That's kind of a brief overview of roadside plants. Like I said, there's many to look at, but those are a few highlights. So a summary of what we've learned today: how to ID plants in CRP plantings using multiple methods. We can use a seed mix as a guide, age of the planting as a guide. We looked at field weeds versus prairie plants, general rules for telling them apart. We learned a little bit about roadside plant identification, and we had plants of the day throughout. We learned to use newcomes again for 5 key plants of the day. Of course, we had our challenge plants too. So a challenge for you this week: consider exploring a CRP field if you have access to one, or explore county roadsides and other habitats in your area. Sometimes it's just fun to cruise slowly along county roadsides with no particular destination, just see what you can find. And if you're lucky enough to have access to a CRP field, you can test out some of the techniques that Justin recommended, or just pick another habitat to look at. Share pictures of what you find on the Facebook group. Next week, Justin Meissen and Laura Walter will be discussing remnant prairie. So it'll be another interesting lecture, this time focused on remnants. And in closing, just continue the conversation. We're seeing some great conversations in the Botany Beginners Facebook group. For advanced botanists, answers to today's 20 mystery plants will be shared soon. And let us know how many you got in the Facebook group. And this is the final mystery plant. It's taken in dim lighting, but it is because this was taken along ragbri. So the only traffic on the road was bicyclists. As a pretty safe environment. So that's why I was able to be there at sunset and capture this particular picture. And with that, Justin and I are open to any questions before we close for the evening.
Okay. The first question is, why has the ditch lily disappeared, and is that a deliberate loss?
Yes, I'm not familiar with what plant the ditch lily is, or that it has disappeared. So I guess I would need more clarification on what that plant is, unless Justin happens to know, but I'm not aware of that particular plant.
So there's, of course, there's a couple different lilies that you might find in the ditch. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, it could be daylily. There's even I've seen tiger lilies in the ditch, but there's the native Michigan lily that does sometimes persist in ditches. I see the orange daylily. So that is, it's actually very, so that's a non-native species. It's typically pretty aggressive. I don't know what I'm sure different roadside managers have different strategies for it. I don't know if it's a deliberate control measure, but yeah, that would be probably a county by county thing. Do you know, Kristine?
I'm not sure how they're managing the lilies, that particular plant.
Next question is, how do you characterize a reconstructed prairie versus a diverse CRP seeding?
So let's see. So the question, do you need me to repeat it again, Paige?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, how do we differentiate between do we answer it here? Sorry, I'm looking for it. Okay, how do you characterize a reconstructed prairie versus a diverse CRP seeding? I would argue they are not actually any different. The only difference is that CRP is a designation, is a program that you would enroll in. So, for example, CP42, the pollinator program, you're able to, enroll in a program where you could create a pretty diverse prairie reconstruction. It's just sort of a mechanism to provide some incentives for keeping land in a conservation cover. So I think ideally that CRP should look more like reconstructed prairies, and that's, I think where we're headed, which is great. So.
Justin, if you want to read and answer Kathy Jans's.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead and keep answering questions then. And so looks like we have a question. Do you have a rule of thumb where there's too much of an invasive plant in an established prairie? Example, Canada thistle or Canada goldenrod. So I would say that under 10% is usually good enough. You'd like to see it under 5%. Certainly once you get more than that, it becomes more about the weeds as opposed to the native plants being able to
Okay, I didn't even look at the chat.
provide the benefits that they do. So yeah, I'd say generally less than 10% is a good threshold for, something that's fairly utilitarian, but 5%, usually keeping under 5% is very hard unless you have a team to help you. So that's just my opinion on that. Let's see, another question. Let's see. How can you add forbs to a ditch planting that seems mixed was predominantly grass, or it was predominantly, and now has been taken over by grasses, 3-year-old planting? I would say it depends on the grass. If it's brome, if the mix didn't establish, you'd have a very different strategy. So any kind of situation where you're dealing with established vegetation, you have to find some way to remove the established vegetation, and usually it's by applying herbicides. That's a whole nother topic. I would say that you can learn about that in the Tallgrass Prairie Guide, reconstruction in the Upper Midwest. But so yeah, you can certainly add forbs, but you want to make sure that if it is cool season grasses that are the grasses, then you want to deal with those first. Let's see, what else do we have here?
Let's do 2 more, and let's do, can you add species to a common CRP mix?
I'm looking for that. Can you see that? Say it again, Paige.
It says, can you add common CRP? Can you add a species to a common CRP mix? I got dismissed.
So can you add a species to a CRP mix? Usually, yes. There are some species for some programs where you can't, like you can't put switchgrass in the pollinator program mixes. But if you have a prairie plant, as long as it's a native plant, you're almost always welcome to add stuff. You might not get cost share for it necessarily over a certain limit of cost, but that would be, but yes, in general, you can add more species to CRP seed mixes.
Any possibility that stiff goldenrod in a 5-year-old pollinator seed mix will decline? Was 1.25% of mix and has taken over.
Question is, will stiff goldenrod decline? It's taken over by year 5. So I would, before we make any management decision, I would want to make sure that it is stiff goldenrod. and sort of what, and it's not Canada goldenrod. So stiff goldenrod can become pretty common. I would say I've not seen it become overly aggressive, especially at only planted at 1% of the mix. So sort of a surprising result. So I guess, yeah, I would give it some time. It's not a bad one to have potentially too much of. So I would just kind of watch it and see if it gets better. But as long as it's not a noxious weed like Canada thistle, it's okay to kind of let it go, I would say.
All right, last question is, can CRP be planted in town between two houses like 45 feet apart by 18 feet apart?
Okay, question is, can CRP be planted in town? No, it cannot. CRP is definitely agriculture only. Even enrolling in CRP can be challenging. If you do have ag land, it does have to meet certain specifications. I believe a lot of programs need highly erodible lands. So it's not a thing that's open for everyone necessarily, but a lot of people do have situations where they can take advantage of that program. Depends on, some cities, I don't know of any. Actually, I don't know. I think some cities in Iowa might have some programs for encouraging native pollinator plantings in town, but you'd have to check with your local municipality on what's available. To my knowledge, there's not any statewide programs like that.
All right, everyone, thanks for tuning in. If we did not get to your question, we will email you directly. And we can't wait to see you for IDing remnant prairies next week. Have a good night, everyone.